hour later, you arrive in the hollowed valley. It murmurs with motion as dozens of people look up from their daily tasks to see your arrival.
The fell voice rumbled. The 4 figures, accompanied by 5 much more bruised figures and 2 singed wolves, made their way carefully down the snowy slope. Far above them, the kids looked down upon the scene like ancient gods, shadowed by spectral hooded figures with achingly bright red eyes.
They lead you to the largest tent in the valley, which, despite being the nicest, is still roughly made.
The demon rumbled. Onyx hands twirled above the kids' heads, dripping a steady patter of inky droplets onto the snow, which curled and twisted into little figures that stepped forward anxiously, weapons half drawn. Tents unfurled from the snowy ground as the most armored figure stepped forward.
"Why did you bring these people here, Ulrich? You know our rules about outsiders. It's to keep us safe,"
the armored figure said in a high voice. They removed their helmet to reveal a woman's strong, angled face.
"I tell them that we're here to slay the necromancer, and I use some cantrips to create little sparks and levitations and stuff,"
spoke up the scrawny kid. Tiny weapons shuddered and flew out of the scabbards of their own volition, and the snow swirled around the sparking sorcerer. The woman faded for a moment as a dye tumbled within her, then regained opacity. She nodded curtly to the group and motioned them into her tent. Suddenly, the snow blew backwards. The stars winked out and the hooded figures stepped backwards until their cloaks merged together in an unbreakable wall that stretched to the ceiling. A moment passed, then a crimson bonfire spluttered to life beside the table, casting a glow on the various bandits sitting inside the patchwork cloth tent. Jolder sat on a splintered stool at the table too.
She speaks with you about your plans to defeat the necromancer, and seems emboldened by your easy defeat of the bandits and clear magical abilities,
says the demon.
She will give you what you need to fight them.
The bandit leader opened a heavy oaken chest against the canvas wall, then began pulling out items and weapons and setting them on the table.
She says you may each take one.
The scrawny kid bent down over them and began poking through them as Jolder reached immediately for a bejeweled ring, tucking it carefully into a pocket. The curly-haired boy caught his eye, and he shrugged.
"For my wife. I'm not home much with this business, so..."
he said, shrugging again. He was interrupted by a cry of delight from the girl as she pulled free a knife seemingly chiseled from a single ruby. It glittered darkly in the firelight as the demon spoke.
"It will always return when thrown, O rogue."
The curly-haired boy pocketed a bag of coins.
"That has no magical properties,"
the demon said, confused, while the curly boy hair just grinned and winked. And the scrawny kid pulled a glowing glove from the pile. The demon muttered softly.
"It casts powerful fireballs once a day, O summoner."
As he slid it on, the kid began writing this down excitedly on a heavily creased sheet he pulled from his pocket. He ripped it. The kid rolled his eyes in annoyance and reached into his bag to pull out a thick stack of papers, thumping them on the table. The 2 other kids and Jolder looked at the papers in bemusement, while the scrawny kid took one off the top, titled it Items, and began writing. The girl swiped a page from the pile and scribbled a small note on it, folded it, and held it into the air.
"Mr. DM, could you maybe, work this into the story somehow? I think it would be cool for my character."
The bandit leader plucked it out of the air with a smile, and with eyes reflecting the crimson light of the fire, popped it into her mouth and swallowed it without chewing. The fire flared brighter for a moment. A scream broke the silence. The tent walls dissolved around them, and the scene flowed as black smoke back onto the tabletop, where the snowy valley took form. The valley glowed a soft white from the snow, but the rest of the room was a void. One of the papers on the pile floated off the pile as if blown by a slight breeze. It twirled and spun slowly above the table, fading into a deep black colour. Abruptly, the paper stiffened and began folding upon itself, incredibly quickly. A black figure of papery angles dropped out of the air a second later, landing in the valley. The origami man, folded of black paper and wearing a black suit, stood silently in the snow. The pile of paper suddenly blew apart, and dozens of sheets went tumbling through the air. They began stiffening and folding as well, dropping into the clearing to form origami tents, carefully folded bandits running for safety and shelter, and hundreds of immensely detailed paper skeletons emerging from the forest. The dark man walked silently around the figures, unseen. 4 sheets of paper twirled and twisted into an elf with a hammer, a human carrying a staff, a thick man with a broadsword, and a small knife-wielding woman. They dropped into the clearing, facing the approaching horde. The curly-haired boy shouted loudly, "I charge!" And the origami elf began running heedlessly towards the skeletons. "No, we need a—" "And he's off," said the scrawny boy in dismay. The sorcerer hefted his paper staff and pointed it towards the army. "I suppose this is as good a time as any. I cast Fireball!" Several papers floating around the table suddenly shredded into tiny strips and streaked into the valley, forming tiny flames and curls of smoke that blasted towards the horde. Every skeleton outstretched their hands as one, and tiny bits of paper ripped free and folded into hundreds of tiny dice. Hundreds of tiny paper dice were tossed to the ground, then picked back up by the skeletons, just as the fireball hit. About a third dissolved into strips of paper. The other 2/3 dived out of the way or raised folded shields. The man of black paper walked through the paper flames without pause, eyeing the dissolving skeletons with something approaching excitement. Without pause, the curly-haired elf smashed into the front line, hammer swinging. Every few seconds, the boy would drop his dice into the valley and peer at the numbers showing, and all the skeletons would pull tiny paper dice from their palms and roll them quickly. Meanwhile, the rogue woman swung her knife into the air, letting it boomerang through paper skulls before returning to her grip. A skeleton lunged as she caught it and swung a blade into her side.
You take damage from the sword, but you do have an opportunity to react.
The demon's voice rumbled.
"I slash at its ribcage!"
The girl shouted. Her little paper figure swung its tiny blade out, carving away some of the skeleton's folded ribs and causing it to stumble back. The origami woman straightened and drove her blade directly into the skeleton's forehead. It dissipated into tiny shreds of paper that floated away on an unseen breeze, joining the slowly churning maelstrom of paper around the table. The scrawny kid fired magic missile after magic missile into the skeletal crowd, blasting them to oblivion.
Can you do this as much as you want?
The demon asked curiously. The scrawny kid paused, then nodded to the tiny black man prowling through the battlefield. "You're right. I'll run out of spell slots. I cast..." And he was cut off by a massive white shape, charging out of the horde and slamming into him. A skeletal minotaur. The girl shrieked and clapped her hands together. "Yes!" It ploughed into the human sorcerer, who dropped his staff and scrabbled helplessly against the snow. The scrawny kid rolled his dice frantically, but watched as the minotaur punched his figure and clawed him viciously across the face.
An arm raised, and Jolder crashed into the Minotaur, broadsword slicing deeply into its chest.
The demon thundered. Its voice betrayed a childish glee at the action. Jolder's origami figure went tumbling into the snow, Minotaur underneath him. It hacked ferociously at the beast, then paused and rolled a dice. The Minotaur did not roll a dice. The dozen skeletons creeping up behind him did. They all grinned empty smiles and took a step forward, then another, until they could have touched Jolder. Then they leapt, knives and swords jabbing deeply into him.
Jolder grunted in surprise, but he was helpless to resist the surprise attacks of so many foes.
The demon whispered into the night air. The little black man dove in front of Jolder, but was sliced to ribbons instantly and thoughtlessly. Jolder's figure struggled for a moment, then fell limp. The scrawny kid's face, stricken and pale, turned to the others. "I didn't mean for him to die! He didn't need to do that!" He turned back to the scene as the figure picked himself up. "I cast magic missile at those jerks!" Bolts of paper spun out from his hands and blew the skeletons apart, leaving only spinning curls of paper behind. As the curly-haired elf slammed his hammer into the particularly large skeleton and the rogue woman plucked her red paper knife out of the air, a wave of force rippled across the valley, reverberated past the kids and into the void. The demon spoke, its voice like the fell tolling of a bell striking midnight.
You feel that dark energy twist through the battlefield, and a dreadful emptiness fills you.
The kids simultaneously shivered as the chill of the wind and snow finally drives through them, and a small figure emerged from the trees, the only one not folded of paper. A small man in a purple cloak. The demon's voice sounded both eager and anxious as it rumbled through the void.
The necromancer arrives on the battlefield.